Welcome, students. As we continue our notes on the presidency, we're going to take some notes on economic policy. We're going to look at fiscal policy and monetary policy. Stuff dealing with money. So, economic policy is the title of our notes. Let's begin. Taxation. There's three different types of taxes. There's the proportional flat tax, there's the progressive tax, and there's the regressive tax. And when it comes to economic policy and taxation policy, there's three different options that you have. The flat tax is that everybody has the same percentage of taxes that they have to pay. Now, obviously, that the money that you pay is going to look different. But the percentage is the same. So if it's a flat 15% for everybody, that means the poor pay 15% of their lower income and the rich pay 15% of their higher income. The purpose of that is to keep from loopholes from happening, to make sure the rich pay their fair share. Because when you get to the progressive tax, that means that the lower class is paying only maybe 10% and the upper class is paying 40%. But are they really paying 40% because of all the deductions and all the different loopholes that they get away with? Oftentimes, the rich end up paying nothing in taxes. But then you have the regressive tax, and that's the greater tax burden on the low income. And very few endorse that. But the purpose of that is that to basically have the poor pay for the services that the government provides that they would be using already, because the rich don't use those services as much. Major source of federal income. Number one is going to be income tax. That's since the 16th Amendment. Before the 16th Amendment, in the 1900s, it's only about 100 years old, we got most of our taxes from trade, but now income is 40% of our tax revenue is from what you make. Number two is a FICA tax, which is a payroll tax. That's through the source of Medicare and Social Security. So when your employer taxes your income, you never see the actual dollar amount that you've made, the gross dollar amount. You only see the net dollar amount, the lower amount, because they've already taken out taxes. Isn't that so nice of them? And so 40% of the American government's revenue is from that income tax. 7.65% is from that FICA tax, so that the federal government can fund Medicare and Social Security and other entitlement programs. You also have corporate income taxes. That is 15 to 35%, just lowered to 21% of all taxable income. And so that corporate income tax is not just a personal income tax that individuals pay, but also large corporations have to pay a tax as well. And that's been lowered under Trump's administration. As you can see with this graph, the different types of taxes that we just went over, you have the individual income tax, then you have the payroll tax and the corporation tax, and then some other miscellaneous taxes, such as sales tax and excise tax and such, customs duties. As you can see right here, this is the progressive tax breakdown. If you make less than about $10,000, then you only pay 10%. If you make over $500,000, then you pay 37%. For most Americans living in California, if you own a home, you have to make somewhere in this bracket. So you're probably paying about 25% or so. If you file as married and combine income and combine your taxes, then you have a lower tax filing, as you can see there. So payroll withholding system deducts monthly taxes difference paid in April. And so payroll, they will deduct every 2 weeks the taxes that you owe, and then you get the money back at the end of the year in January, around April. You have to file out one of these called a W-4 form. when hired to determine the income tax withholdings that you will be withheld. Then you'll get an earnings statement every 2 weeks. You'll get an earnings statement that shows your gross salary right here, which looks like a very big number. And then your net salary will also be indicated as well, which is a lower salary. You can see the 2-week period, but then the year to date right here. No, this is not my bank statement or earnings statement. But then you can see this depressing place right here, which is the taxes and deductions. You can see the year to date, the federal withholdings, and then you can also see the other taxes that are taken away. If you live in the state of New York, then it would be $63 right there, FICA tax, over $100, federal withholdings, and such. W-2 is issued after the first of the year, shows record of earnings and taxes withheld. And so this document is given in late January by your employer. And this is what you use to file your taxes with. And so you can see in the first column, you have the yearly, what your income was. But then you have the different withholdings that you can see right here from Social Security, federal income tax, Medicare, and such. Other federal taxes, we have the excise tax. That's on specific goods. An excise tax would sometimes be considered the sin tax, is an example. The sin tax is on cigarettes, on alcohol, things like that. So an excise tax is something specifically on a good. You also have a gift tax. So if you gift something to somebody else that has a large dollar value, you have to pay a tax on that. You also have an estate tax. When your estate or your property is up for sale or up for auction when you've passed, you also have to pay that. So it's kind of like a death tax. You also have customs duties. So when we trade with other countries, there's those customs duties. Then you also have state and local taxes. You have income, sales, property. So it's not just at the federal level, but also at the state level that we are taxed. That income and sales and property tax is at the state and local level. All those other taxes that we were talking about is at the federal level. Back to where the government gets their money. And again, this is federal taxes. State taxes is on top of this. The Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy is the use of taxation and spending to guide the economy. It's the realm of Congress and the president. And so when people vote for a president, they usually are voting for somebody who has a sound fiscal policy or a fiscal policy that mirrors what the voter desires. And so fiscal policies, that use of tax and spend. How are they going to gather money for the government, and how are they going to spend money? The government does. Monetary policy manages the money supply. So it's not just about taxing and spending, it's also about the value of the money. Manages the money supply, inflation rates. This is the realm of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is a private bank, and that's why it's able to function as it is. However, the president of the Federal Reserve is elected by the President of the United States. And so electing the president is going to influence the Federal Reserve, president, and also the inflation rates there. We will talk about inflation rates on the next slide, about how higher inflation happens when the money is poor and lower inflation happens when our money is good. Inflation is not a good thing. Let's look at inflation here. Federal responsibilities, so control the money supply, adjust interest rates, help ensure the value of the dollar. So when our economy is doing well, our dollar is worth more. When our economy is not doing well, it's not worth as much. And that's because of the power of borrowing. Our government will borrow money from private investors in America or from overseas. We'll look at a graph that will show where our borrowing happens. Believe it or not, China owns less than 10% of our debt. So they don't own as much as you would think. But the federal government will borrow money, and so that'll cause our dollar to decrease in value, which is called higher inflation. It's kind of funny how high actually means bad and low means good. But in inflation, that's how it is. Control the money supply and just interest rates. Interest rates are another way that the dollar increases or decreases in value. Interest rate is basically when you borrow money from a bank, especially in a mortgage or maybe it's a car or something of that nature. You borrow money, you borrow at a certain interest rate. If it's a high interest rate at like 20%, you're going to be paying more towards that interest rate versus the principal of what you bought the car or something else from. A lower interest rate is going to be more healthy, like a 2.9 interest rate. Or right now, houses are below 2% interest rate, which means that when you pay back for that house, you're giving less money to the interest and more to the principal of what the product actually costs. Check clearing, distribute and destroy currency, and supervise member banks. So Federal Reserve responsibilities, the main ones that we're concerned with is the interest rates and the value of our money. However, they do the check clearing. They distribute and destroy the currency. So when we get new dollar bills out there, they print that. When our dollar bills are worn out, they destroy those, and supervising the member banks because they have different federal banks throughout the United States. As you can see right here, we have 12 districts of the Federal Reserve. The West Coast is probably the largest one territorially, with San Francisco being the head. And then one of the smallest ones might be Philadelphia, that represents just Jersey and Philly there. Budget. Budget approval process. The OMB prepares budget for President. President submits a budget to congressional approval. Congress must approve and President must sign off. If this does not happen, then the government goes into shutdown, and we've had that happen a few times because we're in such deficits and whatnot. We are slowing down our ability to approve a budget. The fiscal year is from October 1st to September 30th. And so it's not the calendar year that we have from January to December, but October to September is the fiscal year. So the president needs to plan a budget, and Congress approves it because, remember, Congress alone has the power of the purse strings to provide money to the president to spend. The budget. Uncontrollable mandatory versus controllable discretionary spending. So there's the uncontrollable spending that is necessary for our economy to work. But then you also have the controllable that is discretionary, and you'll hear that word discretionary a lot. What is mandatory? Mandatory is entitlement programs, Social Security, and Medicare, and Medicaid. Those are things that we have to pay. Also, interest on the national debt, we have to pay that. So we might want to, cut spending on social programs and everything, but those are laws. Those are put in place. So unless those laws change, we have to spend those. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, is things like the military and everything else, like education or transportation. Those are things that each president can spend more or spend less depending on their foreign policy, depending on their view of education and such. The debt. Unexpected expenses that happen during a presidency would be wars, natural disasters, economic downturns, coronavirus. Those are things that are unexpected. Government typically does not save, so we adjust spending or borrow. If we borrow money, then what do you think happens to that money? Well, the federal budget deficit happens. Results of government expenditures being larger than revenues occurs in a specific year's budget. And so Donald Trump was having a good economy. Then the unexpected coronavirus happened. Or did it happen? Is it just fake news? Well, we spent $2 trillion, so it better be something that's real. It better not be just be fake news. Otherwise, we spent $2 trillion for nothing. The national debt, the total amount borrowed from investors to finance deficit spending. And we'll look at the different debt over the years in the last 20 years where it has amounted because it's grown quite considerably. I want to say $20 trillion it's grown just in 20 years. So national debt is the total amount borrowed from investors to finance deficit spending, that national debt. How much do we borrow to finance what we cannot have, what we cannot have the money to spend on? So the budget debt, current debt right now is $21 trillion. Almost half of the national debt is held by foreign countries. So as I mentioned, as you can see here, you have foreign countries. China only has about 10% of our debt, or a little less than that. Solutions to debt: cut spending, raise taxes. Let's go back to there. So you could cut spending or raise taxes, but both of those would infringe on the economy, especially the raising of taxes. However, the cutting of spending is more of a Republican approach. The raising of taxes is more of a Democratic approach. It depends on your view of the economy. It depends on where you think that economic growth or economic slowdown would come from. Is cutting taxes going to slow down growth because you believe that the government is the responsible party in starting the economy? Or do you believe that private companies are responsible for the economy's growth? And so raising taxes is going to hurt them. I believe personally a little bit more on the entrepreneur and the American system of capitalism. Though it has its problems, that capitalism is where economic growth happens. So foreign countries, Japan holds just about as much of our debt as China does. So I don't think that we're in too much fear there. The budget debt, you don't need to write these down, but in 2000 it was 5.6 trillion. Today it is 26.4 trillion. That is as of today, this morning. It might have gone up to 26.5, actually, I think it did. The U.S. has not been debt-free since 1835, which was under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And being debt-free isn't necessarily a good thing. You want to have a certain amount of debt so that you can pay for things that are needed. But the debt that we're at right now is pretty ridiculous. As you see right here, under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, he had budget surpluses. Being at the end of the Cold War, that definitely helped out with his economy. Right here, we were fighting the Cold War. We had great economic growth that happened. But because of that great economic growth, there was some debt that was happening. But the economic growth was so much greater than the debt. And we can see that right here with the budget surpluses that happened. Remember that Bill Clinton was not a staunch Democrat. He was under the Democratic Party, but he was more of a moderate. He worked with Republicans, and so he was able to get those surpluses. He was able to sell bases and not spend as much on the military, and his decision to compromise on universal health care and not provide that definitely create these budget surpluses right here. This is where we've been projected currently. This was the 2009, 2008 recession that we went through, but 2020 would probably bring it down a little bit more. As you see right here, debt by the presidencies. You can see the different debt. This is during World War II and the end of the Great Depression. High deficits. This is our Great Recession that we went through, and those high deficits there as well. Pretty interesting graph if you want to pause and look at that a little bit more. So major spending. The only things that you need to note here is what is underlined. Again, we have the Social Security, the National Defense, Medicare, healthcare, including Medicaid. If you already wrote those down previously, you don't need to write those down again. But it's definitely good to know that those are the different types of spending in a sense, or taxes that we need to take. Actually, I think our first slide we wrote down most of those. So if you don't want to write those down, that's fine. But we have different things like veterans benefits and transportation, natural resources, general science, administration of justice. Those are different things that we have spending on. As you can see right here, this is a graph on the spending chart. Kind of gives a visual of what we spend on. So even though military is discretionary spending, it's not mandatory spending. It's not as much as you would think. It's only 16% of our budget. But the Medicare and Social Security are the mandatory. So it's the largest of the discretionary spending, that is for sure. But when it comes to the others, it's not. This is projected mandatory discretionary spending and interest in federal debt. So you see right here, mandatory is 65%, discretionary is about 30%. So when you elect a president, you're electing the percentage that they're going to spend in discretionary spending there. Then you also have the interest on federal debt, which is 6%, pretty high. Spending, Social Security, created in 1935, over 20% of the budget, most expensive along with Medicare. Current workers pay into system, not a private account. So today's workers are paying today's retirees. 2017 average was $13.42 a month, max of $26.87 a month. So that's the payout that you get when you retire. Can begin receiving benefits at 62, but reduced. 1935, 25 workers to one beneficiary. Today it's 3 to 1. So back in 1935 it made sense. 25 people helping that one person that was elderly or couldn't work. But today it's 3 people supporting one. So you can see how broken the system is. And before the 1930s, old people that retired, they were taken care of by their children, who were working, and that's how it worked. It was kind of more private run, if you will, the household. But now that the federal government has a welfare state, the federal government is providing for those poor people that can't work, the retirees, so to speak. And so definitely we've had a switch in priorities or burden of who takes care of the older. It's no longer the children that take care of the older, but it's the government, which then passes it on to the children. Major problems, baby boomers, life expectancy started to grow, so we had a lot of more people being born and higher life rate. That has caused the Social Security to become the monster that it is. As you can see right here, you have full retirement age at 62, benefit by year of birth. However, after 1960, that's gone up to 67. Full retirement age is 67. And you can see the percentage that you get if you retire at 67, which is definitely a lot more than 10% more than if you retire at 65. So wait out 2 more years. Thank you for taking these notes.